sir, on the issue.
Just before we start, it's been reported to me during the break that there are one or two people who are listening remotely who've had difficulty in hearing, not you, not me, but I'm afraid you, Mr. Stevens, and you're the most important person to be heard here as the witness. So it's, I think, it may well be a technical problem. Bear with us, please, those who are watching remotely, and I hope it will be sorted. But if you need to take time or speak a bit more loudly, you'll understand why that is, I'm sure. Thank you.
So, in answer to the query you raised before the break, I've got a copy, not in a form I can put on screen, I'm afraid, because it's not been redacted, but I've got a copy of the text of the undertaking that was to be given in accordance with the Mcfarland Special Payments No. 2 Trust Deed. And it reads as follows: in expectation of receiving from the Mcfarland Special Payments No. 2 Trust the sum of, and then the sum obviously would depend upon the individual tariff, I undertake with the Secretary of State for Health that I will not at any time hereafter bring any proceedings against the Department of Health, the Welsh Office, the Licensing Authority under the Medicines Act 1968, the Committee on Safety of Medicines, any district or regional health authority, or any other government body involving any allegations concerning the spread of HIV or hepatitis viruses through Factor 8 or Factor 9, whether cryoprecipitate or concentrate, administered before the 13th of December 1990.
Well, thank you for that. That seems to make it clear that the undertaking was given to the Secretary of State.
And we're getting a copy of an Eileen Trust undertaking as well, just to double check the wording in that regard. Mr. Stevens, the trustees recognised at an early stage of the Mcfarland Trust that the issues of life insurance and mortgage protection were hugely important issues for the cohort of beneficiaries with which the trust was concerned. Is that right?
Yes.
If we look at MACF 602 _ 002, please. We have looked at this one before. So these are the minutes of the first meeting on the 29th of March 1988. And if we go to the second page, please. We look at the item, it's the first half of the page, item 88.5, life insurance / mortgage protection. This is recorded. The chairman reported that at one of the preliminary meetings with the Secretary of State for Social Services, assistance had been promised with exploration of the above topics. And then if we look at the next paragraph, it says that this formed the crux of the future allocation policy of the Trust, and the chairman undertook to pursue the question further with Mr. Stevens. As far as you can recall, was any assistance forthcoming from the Secretary of State with regard to either of these issues?
Sorry, I don't recall any direction or any work emanating from the Secretary of State to resolve these issues. There may have been some, I don't recall it. But certainly I was charged by Alan Tanner to pursue the questions simply because I worked in the City of London, basically. And I did.
I'm not going to go through the details of all the meetings at which it was discussed and the papers you produced. You produced two papers, I think, in the second half of 1988 on the issue of mortgages. And then in early 1989, Mr. Grinstead produced a paper which raised the question of lending money in exchange for an equity share. And I want to just look with you at then the trustees meeting that followed that. So that is MACF 602 _ 013, please. So we can see these are the minutes of a meeting on the 16th of February 1989. If we go to the third page, we look at the bottom half of the page under the heading Mortgages. We can see there a reference to Mr. Grinstead's paper, and then in the last paragraph, general discussion on the matter of the principle of assistance with house purchase. It was agreed that the paper offered a major step forward and that the principle of equity sharing could represent an important element of a policy which protected the interests of the trust as well as providing help to individuals at the lowest possible running costs. Now, again, I don't need to take you to all of it, but that was in due course confirmed as trust policy. And I want to look at one of the policy documents with you. Showing it's MACF 5081_127, please. So this is one of 3 policies approved by the Trust in July of 1989. One was about equity sharing mortgages in substitution of an existing mortgage. There was a general policy on home ownership, and this is the equity sharing mortgage purchase of property. And if we just go to the second page, bottom half of the page, under the heading Equity Share, we'll see what's described as the key feature of the Trust's policy. The key feature of the Trust's policy in granting a mortgage loan is the Trust's right, in return for not charging interest, to participate in the value of the property. Equity sharing means that upon the occurrence of certain events, the Trust will be entitled to a return of its money plus a share of any appreciation in the capital value of the property, which share will be the same proportion as the loan made by the Trust bears to the total of the original funding. Now, first of all, Mr. Stevens, as far as you can recall, were these written policies, this is one of the 3 policies relating to mortgages, were they shared with or provided to beneficiaries?
Sorry, what was the final words to your question?
Were these policies, copies of these policies, shared with or provided to beneficiaries?
Yes.
How was that done? How were these policies made available?
In response to requests for help from beneficiaries. The document you're looking at is the equity share relating to purchase of the properties, which is slightly different from the equity sharing as a substitution for existing mortgages. Can I refer you, please, to MACF 5081_131.
So this is the policy on home ownership.
Yeah.
It'll come up in a moment.
And if you look at the opening paragraphs of the general policy, the Trust is established to relieve the needs, etc., etc., that's fine. Home ownership is not recognised per se as an area of need, but may be the most cost-effective or even the only method of meeting the need for housing. Now, that's quite key. The prime objective of the Trust is to enable beneficiaries to preserve a balance of disposable income after housing costs have been met. And then if we go down the page to paragraph 5 there.
It's the bottom of the page, thank you.
So we will only be prepared to allocate monies to the provision of private housing where this is the only option available to help provide or maintain satisfactory living accommodation. The Trust will not help with home ownership as a form of insurance to provide security. Very large grants are not available. Now, that was agreed as a matter of policy on the 28th of July 1989. And if you go on to the third page of that document, and this bottom section, A, rescue of existing mortgage, that sets out the circumstances in which the trust would offer help where there was a property, a family home under mortgage, and it says where reduced circumstances result in a threat to a mortgage, maintenance of the family in its existing home is clearly a preferred solution. And then they ask a number of questions. Now, equity sharing as a substitute for existing mortgage was actually I think was the more common of the two forms, rather than provision of a mortgage for purchase, for new purchase. Can I then refer you to MACF 602_017?
Are these the minutes of the July 89 meeting?
Yeah. I haven't got a page number, but if you go to
Page
item
5.
number 89.59, that's it. So the document, Chairman drew attention to the document which had been discussed and outlined at the previous meeting, which is the one we've just been looking at. Certain redrafting going on. And then B, equity sharing mortgage and substitution of existing mortgage. Chairman invited a detailed review of the second final draft of the document. And I think it's worth going on to the final paragraph, paragraph C there, where the chairman basically thanked Clifford Grinstead for, it was a huge amount of work, and the meeting as a whole endorsed this sentiment. I think there was a feeling in some quarters that the trust policy on mortgages was badly thought out, or maybe off the cuff, or something like that. It was a result of a lot of detailed work by Grinstead, and then consideration by the board. There were not many of these equity sharing mortgages granted. And I seem to recall when I subsequently became chairman, that we had legal advice. By then, the rules have changed, and we could no longer give this sort of loan, so we had to stop doing it. But at the outset, it was quite an important contribution to the task we had to do, which was to help people.
Can you recall whether there was any discussion, either at the time these three policies were being agreed, or subsequently, of whether it was right for the trust to effectively be able to make a profit in the event?
It didn't. This word profit relating to the trust is, I find, most extraordinary. And you're not the first person who's expressed it. The trust made interest-free loans on these mortgages, quite substantial, even if they didn't qualify for being very large grants, quite substantial. So this was money that was being taken from trust funds that could otherwise be spent on other people who had other needs. So when the beneficiaries of an equity sharing mortgage had realised some appreciation in the value of their house, it seemed only reasonable that the trust should share in that appreciation and enable the trust fund to be maintained to help all beneficiaries. Simply a question of fairness. I think that's probably all I need to say there.
It is.
I've got there are further documents relating to one particular case, which may or may not come up.
Is this right then? The trustees.
Excuse me, I've just got a strange windows just come up on my screen. I'm just going to get rid of it. Okay.
Is this right then, that the trust didn't either at the time these policies were being approved or subsequently have any concerns or qualms or worries about receiving, I'll avoid the use of the word profit, a share of any appreciation in the capital value of the property?
I don't think there were any qualms. I don't recall any concerns being expressed. I think we recognised that we had very limited funds, which was the source of so much aggravation over the years, and that by helping people, as said in one of those earlier reference, by helping people as something which is not recognised per se as an area of need, maybe the only method of meeting the need for housing. By doing that, we were using funds that could otherwise be helping people with children's education, with holidays. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this window again. Just being generally helpful on a broader front, and that the people who benefited from these mortgages, the equity sharing mortgages, had the benefit of the appreciation in value of their property. What it doesn't say in those documents is that, of course, but I think it does in the detail of the deeds, if the value of the property went down, not as a result of neglect, but simply just market forces, the trust would share in that depreciation as well. So it was even-handed, but it ensured that the scarce trust funds retained value even after looking after this particular requirement.
Could we just go back, Shomik, to MACF 5081_131? This is the policy on home ownership. Just look at the very top paragraph under the heading Policy on Home Ownership. It says, this document is confidential to the trustees for use in the development and application of policy on assistance with home ownership. It is not intended for publication or for release to applicants or their representatives. Now, whether that's the case in relation to the other two policies, I don't think they contain the same wording, but why was the document that here not intended to be shared with applicants or beneficiaries?
I couldn't tell you. I can't remember. Maybe because we didn't want to see it splashed over the front page of the Daily Mail.
In terms of the issue of life insurance, if we go please to MACF 5076_026. We go to, these are the notes of a minutes of a meeting with the Department of Health on the 7th of September 89, which I'll come back to for a different reason in a few minutes. But if we go to the 5th page, please, Shomek. If we look under the heading Life Assurance, it says the subject of assistance with life assurance was discussed. It was apparent that there was no government action in hand which would be likely to bring any early relief. There was a difference in recall between Mr. Heppel, he was Department of Health official, and the Reverend Tanner as to what assurances had been given by the Minister on this subject at the time the grant was made. Mr. Heppel agreed to make further inquiry. From inquiries that the trustees had made, it was very clear that insurance companies were not interested and no help would be forthcoming from the industry. Is this right? Your attempts to explore with insurance companies whether they would be willing or able to assist in arranging for life assurance for your cohort of beneficiaries didn't get anywhere.
No, that's right. That final sentence is basically stating what I was able to report. I had a discussion with a number of insurance companies and the insurance company representative body, and it was quite clear that they were not interested.
Was the possibility of any form of government-backed insurance scheme ever pursued further, as far as you can recall?
I can't recall specific. I'm sure that that Alan Tanner and Clifford Grinstead had frequent meetings with Strawn Heppel and John Canavan at the department. So I'm sure that this was raised, and it was apparent that there was no government action in hand which would be likely to bring any early relief. It says there. I think that was an unchanged policy from the government, with no help.
Now, again, still on this early period, 88 to 92, in terms of allocating funds, the Trust established an Allocations Committee or subcommittee which would consider applications for grants. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, absolutely. So we can take this document down, Shomek, thank you. The Trust established at a fairly early stage an Allocations Committee, which I think was a subcommittee of trustees at that point in time, who would consider applications for grants.
Yeah.
And Shomek, if we go please to MACF 604_113. You can see there an early allocations policy. The date of this is October 1988, and we can see the broad nature of the scheme set up, the single payments, sometimes referred to, I think, as grant payments, and then the regular payments.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask you one matter arising out of this policy. If we go to the second page. If we can see the process set out there. All grants are authorised by the Allocations Subcommittee of Trustees. There was delegated authority to the administrator and social worker to make payments up to a certain sum. And then there's a paragraph beginning, payments will not be made for items normally provided by the local authority or Department of Social Security. Now, what did the applicant have to show in that regard to the Allocations Subcommittee or the administrator? Did they have to show that they had first approached the local authority?
Whether they had to show it or whether they just had to say that they had tried, I couldn't tell you. But certainly it was a constant theme of grant making by MFT and by Iron Trust, and I think probably by Caxton as well, that the charities were fallbacks, where we were the sources of finance of last resort, and that people had to do their best to find required finance from somewhere else. We were not substitutes for the social services, social security. We were backup.
What consideration, if any, was given by trustees to the burden that might impose upon those who were themselves extremely ill or caring for those who were extremely ill, that before they could even approach the Mcfarland Trust, which had been especially set up to assist, they had to go, for example, to their local authority and despite ill health, see what they could get out of the local authority?
Well, that is an unfortunate corollary of having been set up as a charity with insufficient funds by the government. It was a constant theme. We never had enough money to do everything we would like to do. So unfortunately, we had to ask beneficiaries to try elsewhere, even when we were aware that this was imposing considerable burdens on them. But we had to do it.
Now, if we look at MACF 605_023, please, Shomik. We go to the third page. And look at the top left-hand side of the page. Under the heading, the 1990 policy, it says the policy of emphasis on regular payments has three purposes, and those are then set out. And then if we go to the bottom paragraph before the heading, the 1992 review, trustees have in this time been able to concentrate expenditure on single payments into areas most directly connected with health or sickness. Very few grants are now made for ordinary household costs. And then if we just go to the next page, this is entitled Trust Grants Policy. It refers to a newsletter from April 1991. And then if we can see reference to an increased level of regular payments. And then fourth paragraph down, it says, as stated in newsletter number 5, the intention behind this change was to move the balance between singular and regular payments towards the regular payments, a process the trustees believed would have two advantages: giving individuals more options, enabling assistance to be more easily adjusted in favour of those whose financial need is greatest. The intention was therefore that the increase in personal income provided would lead to a reduction in the need for single grants, and recent experience appears to justify this view. Consequently, single grants will in future be restricted to health-related issues, and grants for household expenditure will only be made in exceptional circumstances. Grants will not normally be made for routine expenses, nor for occasional expenses such as maintenance and redecoration of property or the replacement of appliances or furniture. Is it right to understand what's being set out in these documents, that there was a shift away from grants to focus on regular pay as the primary means of support in 1990-91?
Yeah.
Was that a reflection of the Trust's limited funds?
Yes, I mean, every aspect of our grant making was determined, was constrained by the paucity of the funding that was made available to us.
And so grants would be restricted to health-related issues. Was there any guidance or explanation as to what was meant by health-related issues, as far as you can recall, at this time?
I suppose, mobility, people who have had particular issues with mobility as a result of their haemophilia. So something that comes to mind. I can't think offhand of lots of examples. But
if we then go, again, this is still within the first period of your post at the Mcfarland Trust, to look at the position of widows and dependents. Shamit, could we have MACF 502_018?
It would have to be 6 zeros, wouldn't it?
I'm so sorry, MACF 602_018. You're absolutely right, sir.
Sorry, I'm just going to go and close the door that's blown open.
So these are the minutes of a meeting on the 28th of September 1989. If we go to page 8, please. You can see their allocation policy widows, and there's a reference to a paper which had been circulated, and then there's a general discussion and the recognition of a need for a statement of policy. If we look at that third paragraph, the need for a statement of policy was recognised, in particular that it was necessary to be able to give some assurance to sufferers that their widows and dependents would be taken care of. At the same time, doubts were expressed on both the principles and the financial capability of long-term care of widows, especially those without dependent children. The principle of a finite period of support after bereavement received some support, though there were differing views of what such a period should be. And then it was agreed that further thought would be given to the matter. Could we then, in the same document, please, go to the paper that's referred to? Sorry, Shamik, it's probably page 25. That's it. So this is the paper, Widows and Other Dependents of Deceased Persons. The deed requires trustees to provide assistance for the needy spouses, parents, children or other dependents of such persons who have died. Leaving aside for this purpose any remaining ambiguity in the definition of what is a spouse, there's a requirement for trusts to agree on how, for all these dependents, the trust will interpret needy. 3, this basic policy decision is needed for 2 reasons. This, sadly, is a growing community which represents a potentially growing expenditure of trust funds, both as a percentage and in absolute terms. And then this is the area of expenditure most vulnerable to criticism by our paymasters as encroaching on the grounds of compensation, and thus could in time affect any decision to allocate any further funds. Are you able to assist Mr. Stevens, and this wasn't a paper authored by you, but with what was being referred to there in paragraph 3b, why it was thought that giving assistance to widows and other dependents would make the trust vulnerable to criticism by our paymasters? Presumably that's a reference to the government.
I think we were concerned that the government would say that the Mcfarland Trust had been set up basically to give support to people with haemophilia who had been infected with HIV. We felt that they would not feel that widows and other dependents were on the same level of priority as the people, as what we used to call the primary beneficiaries. It's just one of those limiting factors that we had to deal with. That we were dealing with politicians, and politicians have different standards sometimes for the rest of us.
So is this correct? It wasn't the trustees' own view that widows and other dependents were secondary or deserving of less consideration. It was the trustees' view that that's how they'd be viewed by government.
We felt that the way the trust had been set up, the objectives for which the trust had been set up, put widows and dependents into a slightly lower priority category from the political point of view and as far as funding is concerned. Given the fact that we never had enough funds to look after everybody anyway, we had to take notice of this fear that I mean, you can see in paragraph 4 there, however distasteful such arguments may seem, they are distasteful. We had to bear in mind that the way the politicians would perceive the trust objectives did not embrace giving widows and dependents exactly the same priority as people who had already had haemophilia and were infected with HIV by the government.
And it would appear from the closing words of paragraph 3b that the trustees thought that expending money on widows and dependents might lead the government not to give further funding to the trust. Is that a correct understanding of 3b?
It doesn't say that. It says it could in time affect any decision to allocate further funds. So it might be thought it would reduce or delay further funding.
The trust deed itself, we can go back to it if need be, but the trust deed itself doesn't create a different priority. It doesn't talk about primary beneficiaries and secondary beneficiaries. So was it something that the government said?
The trust deed doesn't. The trust deed doesn't differentiate in terms of priority. Our fear is, from discussions that the chairman and deputy chairman then had with politicians in the establishment of the draft, that there might be a view in government that people with haemophilia who are infected with HIV were just that little bit more in need of help from the trust, which the government was set up and funding, than their widows and dependents after their death.
And do you know whether
it's all set out there in paragraphs 3 and 4? The arguments, we say, however distasteful such arguments may seem, they were distasteful, but we had to have them.
Do you know whether that was a view that had been expressed in terms to the Reverend Tanner and Mr. Grinstead by government officials?
No, I don't.
The policy that was then produced, I think, in March 1991 for widows and dependents is at MACF 5072_003. So we can see grant making policy, widows and other dependents of deceased persons, March 1991. If we go to the second page, we can see bottom of the page, 4 groups identified, widows, and then top of the next page, parents of deceased adult registrant who were dependent on the registrant at time of death, children and other dependents accepted as such at the trustee's discretion. So those are the 4 categories of dependents being recognised. And then the term needy was then applied to the case of widows and other recognised spouses, as we see in paragraph 8. In the shorter term, the period of bereavement and a period of adjustment, and in the longer term, widows who are HIV infected, widows with dependent children, widows who are disabled or chronically sick. And then we can see, again, in paragraph 9, in relation to the dependent parents of adults, it's short-term provision for the bereavement, in relation to bereavement, and longer-term parents who are disabled or chronically sick. And bottom of the page, we can see no general rule is made for orphaned children. Trustees will consider any such case individually. And then if we go over the page, we can see at paragraph 13, it said the assessment of financial need will take into account all the existing resources and commitments of the applicant and all statutory sources of assistance. This will include the new 1991 settlement payment, so that was to be taken into account, at least in relation to widows and dependents. And then we can see under the heading widows, what was contemplated was there would be an immediate cash payment of £1,000, and then there might be payments for example, for funeral costs. And then in terms of regular payments, they would, I'm paraphrasing here, they would taper off after a period of months. And then in the longer term, regular payments would only be made to widows who were HIV positive. We go to the top of the next page. Widows with dependent children and widows who were disabled or chronically sick. So widows who did not fall into any of those categories would effectively receive nothing after the immediate bereavement payment period and the tapering regular payments. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we just go to the bottom of the previous page again, the position of widows who are HIV positive. Now, what's said there is that widows who are HIV positive would in all respects be treated in the same way as registrants, including regular payments as in the main scheme. So was the intention that the policy adopted in 1991, therefore, that those who, I think are referred to in some documents as infected intimates, but that widows who are HIV positive themselves would be treated as primary beneficiaries?
Yeah.
And would it be right to understand the basis for that was because there wasn't any good reason for distinguishing between those who were directly infected and those who were indirectly infected?
I don't think there was any distinction drawn between the sort of support that those two categories would get.
And
I'm not quite sure. Directly and indirectly.
Well, those who were infected directly through the use of blood products, those who were infected as spouses or partners, this policy appears to be recognising that they should not be treated differently, but the latter category should be treated in all respects the same way as the primary beneficiary.
Yeah, I think 19 subparagraph 1 there covers all widows who are HIV positive, whatever the source of that infection.
Do you know whether, as a matter of fact, that policy was adhered to by the Trust, that infected intimates, as they were called, received regular payments in the same way as other registrants?
I can only say I believe so. I can't. I wouldn't bet the house on it, but I suspect. I believe that.
Are we moving away from
Yeah, we are, sir, yes.
Can I just understand the Trust's position as set out in this document? Picking it up at 19.1, which is still on the screen, the very last words are as in the main scheme. So the main scheme was seen as something different from the scheme, or the supplementary scheme, or whatever it was. Am I right?
I think, and this is all written by Clifford, I think. By the main scheme, he is referring to the regular payments made to primary beneficiaries, to people with haemophilia or people with bleeding disorders who were infected with HIV through the course of their treatment. So this document, which is, I think in his mind, he would call it a subsidiary scheme or a supplementary scheme or something, a secondary scheme, is related to widows. The main scheme refers to this term that was adopted by the trust, fair enough, when I wasn't there, primary beneficiaries.
Now, the expression primary beneficiary was understood to apply to those who had themselves been infected with HIV, but to exclude those who were not in that category. Am I right?
As far as I am aware, the term primary beneficiaries refers to people with bleeding disorders who were infected with HIV through the course of treatment with contaminated blood. So most of those are men. There were one or two who weren't. This paper is referring to the widows and dependents of such primary beneficiaries as had died, some of whom might also be HIV positive, and if they were regarded as primary beneficiaries. They were treated the same way.
In the case of a widow who had no dependent children, am I right in thinking that the effect of this policy would be that after the payments made immediately after bereavement, and perhaps for a short while longer, there would be no payment made at all?
Correct.
Whatever the particular need of that individual was?
Correct.
So this was ruling out the trustee's ability to give money in a case of need, which would be a genuine case of need as most people would see it, as the Daily Mail might see it, on the basis that they weren't in the right category.
Correct. If there were no children and the widow was not infected with HIV, then after a taper period, she was, I'm afraid, cut adrift.
And was any advice taken
if we had had 10 times the amount of money, the policy probably would have been different.
Was any advice taken as to how that fitted with Clause 4 of the original trust deed?
The policy would have been discussed with beneficiaries, at least two of whom were on the board. I don't know whether it would have been discussed with whether legal advice was taken or whether it was further discussed with the department. I think it would have been. I'm sure this document would have been shown to the department, so they were aware of what was going on. But I have to go back to the fact that had we had much more money, then the policy would have been different.
Well, I understand that, but there might be said to be two reactions to limited funds. One is to maintain a category of need for anyone and everyone who qualifies under the trust deed, although the money that can be distributed is necessarily less. The other is to cut out some people who may be in extreme grinding need, but who simply aren't in the right category, a category which is created for those purposes by the trust itself. It was the latter policy that this represents, was it?
Yes.
Thank you.
So is there anything further on this document? Thank you, that can come down. Mr. Stevens, I want to come on to now what has been a theme of your evidence so far, which is the question of the funding that the Mcfarland Trust had. The initial funding was the sum of £10 million. And is this correct, that you as trustees in 1988 had a hope, perhaps, that would be topped up or increased, but no particular idea as to when it might be increased or by how much?
Absolutely. I'm not sure that whether hope is too strong a word. But anyway, yes, we certainly had no idea. And there are notes of a meeting with department officials after about 2 years when they said it's premature to ask for more money at the moment. Come back in 2 years' time.
Yes, and we'll come on to that. I know you weren't involved in the discussions that led to the initial £10 million, but did you have any understanding acquired subsequently as to how that £10 million had been calculated?
No.
Is this correct, that as far as the Trust was aware, that £10 million was not based on any attempt by the government to assess or quantify need?
I have no idea how 10 million was derived.
Now, if we look at MACF 5030_006, this is an interview you gave to Russell Mishcon for the purpose of a dissertation that he was preparing.
Yeah.
If we go to the third page, and we pick it up, and it's the first half of the page. It's in the long answer beginning, so I would say, but it's the last few lines of that answer. You say this: I think the Trust was a short-term fix. And then you say, I think they were caught out by the lack of favourable response, which was why they then introduced the 2 capital payments. And then at that stage, I think they thought, well, OK, that's done and dusted. These people have only a couple more years to go, and we're off the hook. I want to see if I've understood what you meant by that. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Are you there suggesting that the government's approach had been a rough and ready provision of money on the basis or on the assumption that those infected would, for the most part, die fairly quickly?
Yes. Yes.
Do you know whether the Department of Health's allocation of funding to the Mcfarland Trust over the years was ever based on an attempt to quantify actual need?
I'm sure it wasn't. I think they gave us, in answer to our requests and our arguments and our business cases, they gave us what they thought they could afford and what they could get away with.
Want to look at a meeting in September of 1989 with you. If we go first to DHSC 303318_006. We can see this is described as briefing for meeting with the Mcfarland Trust, 7th of September 89. So it's an internal Department of Health document, not I anticipate a document that the trustees would have seen at the time. It refers to the department strictly observing the independent status of the Mcfarland Trust, but then says this: however, MSH, that's the Minister of State for Health, has requested 2 monthly reports on the Trust's activities. Were you and your fellow trustees aware that the Minister of State for Health was seeking 2 monthly reports on your activities?
I certainly am not. I certainly have no memory of it. Whether we were aware at the time, I don't know. But I have no memory. I have no recollection that I was so informed at the time.
And then we can see from paragraph 2, this is, again, it's the internal Department of Health understanding of the purpose of the meeting, but they say this: the Trust seek this meeting to determine whether present activities are in line with government expectations, to seek approval for expansive variations to the Trust deed, to seek approval for a major escalation of financial help in areas they've so far treated with caution. And then if we look at the bottom paragraph on that page, we can see it said the Trust will be looking for a general assurance that their grant allocation policy and investment policy are broadly on the right lines. They feel vulnerable having received no communication from the department. And then the document looks, I'm not proposing to go through the detail of it, but it looks at various different aspects of allocation, dependents, juveniles, and so on. Was it correct, as far as you can recall, that the Trust was seeking the department's approval for its actions, that they were in line with government expectations?
I don't think we were looking for approval. We were telling them what we were doing, explaining why we believed those actions, those policies were in line with what they wanted us to do, and saying we need more money.
We look at the notes of this meeting next. Seamus, it's MACF 5076_026. These are some, the first page sets out some comments from the Department of Health on the notes, but I don't think any of those are particularly material for present purposes. If we go to the second page, you'll see notes of a meeting at the Department of Health, 7th of September 1989. Now, you weren't present at the meeting, Mr. Stevens, but I can tell you this is a record taken by CHG, so that's Mr. Grinstead. So it's the Trust's own record. And we can see from the introduction, Mr. Heppel invited the chairman to open the meeting, and the Reverend Tanner explained that the meeting had been requested so that we could place before the department the policies, schemes and practices that had been adopted by the trustees from the time the Trust was established in March 1988. And if justified, to receive from the department an assurance that such policies and practices were rightly fulfilling the objectives envisaged by the government in setting up the Trust. The meeting could also be a useful forum for discussion of certain principles and interpretations that required to be addressed by the trustees, with the benefit of any guidelines that the department felt able to give. So it would appear from that the Trust was seeking an assurance from the department that the Trust was fulfilling the objectives envisaged by the government. Why did the Trust think it needed that kind of assurance from the government, given it was an independent body with independent objectives?
Because we needed more money. Because we were going to ask for more money.
So it was to keep the government...
I can't remember if we did at this meeting or not, but we knew that the money, the £10 million with which we'd been endowed, was insufficient to do everything that we were trying to do at the time, let alone what we might do in the future.
So is this right, to put it in somewhat colloquial terms, the Trust was trying to keep the government on side, as it were, because it wanted to ask, or would want to ask in the future, for more funding?
We knew that was going to be a requirement, yes.
And if we go to the next page, we can see at the top of the page that the mortgage policies we looked at earlier were provided to the department. And then under the heading additional funding, bottom half of the page, Reverend Tanner brought to the department's attention the most crucial item that would be raised at this meeting, namely the prospect for additional funding of the trust. The trustees were well aware that direct charitable expenditure was exceeding the income received by the trust from money invested and that capital was being withdrawn to meet the deficiency. Nevertheless, the trustees approved such action in belief that the requests for assistance were wholly justified. In addition, the trustees faced requests, particularly in the support for dependent children, that contemplated long-term commitment. It followed that the trustees wished to raise the question whether, if the trust fund was exhausted, any additional funding would be made available by the government to meet the longer-term needs of people with haemophilia and HIV infection and their dependents. Without such additional funding, future expenditure could be considerably inhibited. So that's the request. Will the government make more money available? The response, following discussion, Mr. Heppel responded that ministers would not want trustees to make more limited offers of help than they would otherwise consider reasonable simply to conserve funds, and that each case would continue to be judged on its merits. However, the request for additional funds was a matter of timing, and he advised the trust that the right time to approach ministers about additional funding would be when the trust funds were sufficient to meet commitment for only 2 to 3 years. An approach at the present time would be too early. This advice was gratefully received and would be confirmed by a formal exchange of letters. I know you weren't present at the meeting, but I'm going to assume that this was reported back to the trustees. I imagine it would have been. Can you recall what your view was, either then or now, or as to the adequacy of the department's response to the trustees' request?
I can't recall my reaction then. My reaction now is this is totally in character. Put off the evil day of giving Mcfarland Trust more money until they're on their uppers, until they're on their knees, and then give them half what they ask for. I mean, that's standard practice.
And did this cause real problems for the trust in being able to commit to any long-term support for beneficiaries, whether
we've discussed this. We've discussed this several times already this morning. Of course, it caused problems. This is where the anger that was expressed in Glasgow and Edinburgh and other places stems from. We were never able to do as much as people thought we should do and as we wanted to do because we'd never got enough money. There was never any assurance that the money was going to be forthcoming. It went on all the way through the trust's existence. I have no idea, now that it's all under a single scheme administrator, I have no idea how the beneficiaries are feeling now about what they're getting. Maybe money is pouring out. I have no idea. But as long as we were involved, as long as the Mcfarland Trust was involved, and I was involved with the Mcfarland Trust as a trustee, there was never enough money, and the department never, ever provided us with sufficient assurance that money would be forthcoming. There was a period in the late 80s, when the department would only produce more money when they could afford, when they found it. It was down the back of the sofa. Fortunately, there was a senior civil servant we knew then, Charles Lister, who I suspect you're going to be talking to, who was able to institute a regular predictable annual amount. It was never enough, but at least we knew it was coming. But before then, there was a period when we had no idea when we would see another penny from the department. So I'm sorry, but I get quite aerated by consideration of this sort of discussion that we had time and time and time again with the department and then with ministers. If you look and see, if you look at what I said on behalf of Eileen Trust, I think it was, but maybe to Mcfarland Trust as well, to the Archer inquiry, I was almost speechless with anger at the minister enrolled at the time, who said that she was satisfied that the amount of money they were giving us was enough. And I said she had no right to be satisfied, to express satisfaction. And this was, you know, what the little bit you showed up earlier. The whole attitude was, give them a bit, and we're off the hook. It coloured all our ability to respond to requests. It affected the registrants' attitude to us, because obviously they blamed the trust, not us, not the government. We just something we had to live with.
Now, you...
Sorry, that's a rant. That's not an answer, that's a rant.
You left the Mcfarland Trust in I think early March or thereabouts 1992, and then returned, as you told us at the beginning of your evidence, in 1999.
So I think the society felt that they wanted, quote, one of their own on the MFG board rather than me. That they wanted somebody who represented directly the society rather than somebody who was appointed by, but they never saw me, didn't even know who I was.
So your time as trustee came to an end, and you were not renominated by the Haemophilia Society. Is that how it was?
I was, yes, I was there in the invitation of Alan Tanner, but basically, yes, I appeared as a nominee of the society. So when my time came up, they said, thank you, goodbye. Actually, they didn't say thank you at all.
Now, when you returned in 1999, had the Mcfarland Trust's position in terms of funding from the government significantly changed or improved as far as you can recall?
It had changed in respect to what I said a few minutes ago, that by 1999 they were receiving occasional handouts when the department found some money down the back of the sofa. Unpredictable in amount and unpredictable in time.
And I think if we go back to your interview with Mr. Mishcon at MACF 5030_006, please show Mick. And we go to page 5. We look at the top half of the page. It's the paragraph beginning, one of the things the Trust did in 2001. We can see, picking it up a couple of lines below that, you say, I'd been surprised that the Trust was still operating at a level of £2 million a year in 1999 and 2000. Do you recall being surprised when you came back to discover that the Trust position was essentially similar to how it had been when you left it?
Yeah, no, that's what it says there.
Did you...
The figures, I may have been mistaken in my understanding of what the figures were precisely, but really what we did at the outset, we've got £10 million. So it says there, we should, with investment income, we should be able to make that last about 7 years. And at the time, it was thought that the life expectancy of the beneficiaries of the trust was about 5 to 7 years, so that would just about see the trust out. Now, luckily, that didn't happen. So then, as I said to Russell, my memory was that we just increased our rate of expenditure without telling the government in advance, without asking the government in advance. We just told them. I'm not sure that's actually strictly true at the time, but that's how it seemed to me.
Well, I'm going to look with you, Mr. Stevens, at some of the documents which show the steps taken to try and obtain more funding from the government in the early 2000s. I note the time, so perhaps we could pick that up at 2 o'clock.
Yes, we'll take a break now till 2 o'clock, which I hope gives you time for a lunch. And look forward to seeing you back here at 2 o'clock, if that's okay. So 2 o'clock.
Right.
2 o'clock.